The rain hammered down on the cobblestones outside Buckingham Palace that November morning in 2019, turning the famous forecourt into a maze of puddles and streams. Tourists huddled under umbrellas, their cameras protected beneath jackets and plastic bags, still determined to witness the changing of the guard's ceremony. Among the crowd stood a woman in her late 70s, frail and shaking, not from the cold but from something else entirely. Her name was Margaret Thornton, and she had traveled over 3,000 miles from Nova Scotia, Canada, for this single moment. Margaret didn't carry an umbrella. She didn't seem to notice the rain soaking through her thin coat, plastering her gray hair to her skull, running in rivulets down her weathered face. Her eyes were fixed on one guard in particular, standing motionless at his post, the iconic bearskin hat adding nearly a foot to his already impressive height. His red tunic was darkening with moisture, but he remained perfectly still, rifle at his side, face set in the traditional expressionless mask that Royal Guards are famous for maintaining. What nobody in that crowd knew was that Margaret had been coming to this spot every year for the past 6 decades. Same month, same week if she could manage it. She would stand in the crowd, sometimes for hours, just watching the guards perform their duties with mechanical precision. She never spoke to anyone, never explained why, just watched, with tears occasionally sliding down her cheeks that she would quickly wipe away. But this year was different. This year, Margaret's hands trembled as she pulled a folded photograph from her pocket. The edges were soft from decades of handling. The colors faded to the muted tones of early 1960s film. It showed a young man in a guard's uniform, impossibly handsome, grinning at the camera with the kind of joy that seems to radiate from old photographs. Next to him stood a young woman, her arm linked through his, wearing a blue dress with white polka dots and a smile that matched his own. The guard at the post was Sergeant James Whitmore, 26 years old, serving his 3rd year in the King's Guard. He had been briefed that morning, as all guards are, about maintaining composure regardless of what tourists might do. People tried everything to make them react. Jokes, dancing, making faces, even touching them, which was strictly forbidden. James prided himself on his discipline. In 3 years, he had never once broken character. Not a smile, not a flinch, not even a blink at inappropriate moments. But something about this old woman caught his attention. Perhaps it was the way she stood so still while everyone else jostled for position. Perhaps it was the fact that she was getting absolutely drenched and didn't seem to care. Or perhaps it was the photograph she now held up, arm extended toward him, hands shaking so badly the image seemed to dance in the rain. From his peripheral vision, James could see it, an old guard's uniform, the same bearskin hat he now wore, the same red tunic, the same posture of pride and duty. Margaret's lips were moving. At first her voice was too soft, swallowed by the rain and the murmur of the crowd. But then she spoke louder, and James heard words that would change everything. His name was Thomas Thornton. He stood exactly where you're standing. November 1963. The crowd had gone quiet, sensing something different was happening. Phones were now recording, but not in the usual mocking way. There was a reverence that had settled over the scene. We met at a dance in London. I was a secretary visiting from Canada. He was a guardsman. Margaret's voice cracked. We had 3 weeks together before I had to return home. He promised to write. He promised to come find me when his service ended. James felt something tighten in his chest. He was not supposed to react. He was not supposed to acknowledge. His training screamed at him to remain stone-faced, to stare straight ahead, to be the living statue that tourists expected. He wrote every week for 8 months, then the letters stopped. Margaret was crying now, the tears mixing with the rain. I wrote to the barracks, I wrote to the army, no response. I didn't have money to come back to London. I waited for years. The photograph was deteriorating in the rain, but she held it steady. It wasn't until 1985 that I finally saved enough to come here. I found records. He had died, an accident during a training exercise, May 1964. He was 23 years old. Her voice was barely a whisper now. They never notified me because we weren't married. I wasn't family. I was nobody. James felt his jaw clench, felt his eyes burn. This was not in the training manual. This was not something they had prepared him for. I come every year to stand where he stood, to remember the boy who promised to find me, to honor his service. Margaret's arm was still extended, the photograph still offered like a prayer. This is my last trip. I'm sick. The doctors say I won't see another year. Something broke inside James Whitmore at that moment. He had been trained to be immovable, trained to represent duty and discipline and the crown itself. But he was also human, and standing before him was a woman who had loved a brother in arms, a guard who had stood at this very post 60 years ago, a man whose promises were cut short by tragedy. Slowly, deliberately, James did the unthinkable. He moved his head, just slightly, just enough to look directly at Margaret Thornton. Their eyes met, and in that instant a connection spanning 6 decades clicked into place. The crowd gasped. Cameras captured every second, because what happened next had never been seen before in the modern history of the Royal Guards. James reached out his white-gloved hand and gently took the photograph from Margaret's trembling fingers. He looked at it, really looked at the young man who had stood where he now stood, who had worn what he now wore, who had loved and lost and never got the chance to keep his promises. Then James did something that would cost him a formal reprimand and become viral across every continent within hours. He brought his hand up in a slow, deliberate salute, not to a superior officer, not to royalty, but to the memory of Guardsman Thomas Thornton and to the woman who had loved him enough to spend 60 years honoring his memory. Margaret's knees buckled. 2 tourists caught her, holding her steady as she wept. James held the salute for a full 10 seconds, his own eyes glistening now, his jaw tight with the effort of maintaining some measure of composure. When he finally lowered his hand, he carefully folded the photograph and with impossible gentleness placed it back into Margaret's palm, closing her fingers around it. Then he spoke, his voice rough with emotion, loud enough for her to hear over the rain. He would be honored that you remembered him. Thank you for loving one of our own. The crowd erupted, not in cheers but in applause that seemed somehow reverent. People were crying. Strangers were hugging strangers, and Margaret Thornton stood in the rain, clutching that faded photograph, finally having received the acknowledgement she had sought for 60 years. James returned to his position, eyes forward, face composed once more. But something fundamental had shifted. His commanding officer would later tell him that he had violated protocol, that there would be consequences, that a guard must never, ever break character regardless of the circumstances. But his commanding officer would also quietly add off the record that some moments transcend protocol. Some moments require us to remember that beneath the uniform, beneath the ceremony, beneath the tradition, we are human beings first. Margaret Thornton passed away 3 months later in her home in Nova Scotia. Her obituary mentioned her career as a secretary, her volunteer work at the local church, her love of gardening. It did not mention the guardsman she had loved and lost, or the 60 years she had spent honoring his memory. But in a small ceremony at a London barracks, attended only by a handful of current and former guards, James Whitmore read her story aloud. He shared the photograph, now carefully preserved in a frame, and he proposed something unprecedented. Every November, on the anniversary of that rainy day, one guard would stand at that post wearing a small blue and white ribbon, hidden beneath their tunic, visible only to those who knew to look for it. A reminder that love and memory and human connection sometimes matter more than protocol. The tradition continues to this day, though few know why. And on certain November mornings when the rain falls on Buckingham Palace, tourists sometimes notice that the guard standing at that particular post seems to stand just a little taller, seems to hold his rifle with a little more purpose, as if honoring not just the crown, but also those who came before, and those who loved them enough to never forget. The summer heat in London was unbearable that July afternoon in 2015, the kind of heat that made the pavement shimmer and tourists duck into every available patch of shade. At Windsor Castle, the guards stood at their posts as they always did, impeccable in their uniforms, despite the sweat that ran down their backs beneath the heavy red tunics. Among them was Corporal David Chen, a second-generation immigrant whose parents had come to Britain from Hong Kong in the 1980s. David had joined the Guard to honor his father's lifelong respect for British traditions, and he took his duty more seriously than most. The crowds that day were particularly thick, school groups and families flowing through the castle grounds in waves. David had learned to tune them out, to focus on the middle distance, to become the statue that protocol demanded. But then he heard something that made his heart skip. A child's voice, high and panicked, cutting through the general noise of the crowd. "Mummy, Mummy, where are you?" David's eyes, trained to remain fixed forward, couldn't move to find the source, but his ears tracked the sound. The voice was getting more frantic, closer to his position. Other tourists were noticing now, looking around, but nobody seemed to be taking action. The voice was crying now, hiccuping sobs of pure terror. "I want my mummy, please. Someone help me find my mummy." Every instinct in David's body screamed at him to move, to help, to do something. But his training held him rigid. Guards do not break formation. Guards do not interact with tourists. Guards maintain their posts no matter what happens around them. He had been told stories of guards who remained at their posts during protests, during medical emergencies nearby, even during one incident where a tourist had a heart attack just feet away. The guard had remained immobile while others called for help. But this was a child, a terrified child who was lost and alone in a sea of strangers. The crying was directly in front of him now. David's peripheral vision caught sight of a little boy, no more than 5 years old, with dark curly hair and a bright yellow shirt. Tears streamed down his face as he spun in circles, looking for his mother. The crowd flowed around him like water around a stone, everyone in too much of a hurry to stop and help. David's jaw clenched. His hands tightened on his rifle. Every second that passed felt like an hour. Where was the boy's mother? Why wasn't anyone helping? The child was getting more hysterical, his breathing coming in gasps now, on the edge of a full panic attack. And then the boy did something that changed everything. He ran directly to David and wrapped his small arms around the guard's leg, pressing his tear-stained face against the red fabric of the tunic. "Please help me find my mummy," the child sobbed. "I'm scared. I don't know where she went." David felt the small body trembling against him, felt the desperate grip of tiny fingers clutching his uniform. This was not a tourist trying to make him laugh. This was not someone testing his discipline. This was a terrified child who saw a figure of authority and instinctively ran to it for protection. The protocol was clear. Do not move, do not speak, do not break character, ever. David broke every rule. He slowly, carefully, brought his rifle up and secured it in a resting position. Then he knelt down, bringing himself to the child's eye level. The crowd around them had gone completely silent, phones out, recording what they expected to be a scolding or the guard roughly pushing the child away. Instead, David removed his bearskin hat and set it gently on the ground beside him. He looked directly into the boy's frightened eyes and spoke in the gentlest voice he could manage. "Hey there, little man, it's okay. You're safe now. My name is David. What's your name?" The boy's crying had reduced to sniffles. He stared at David with wide eyes, surprised that the statue had come to life and was speaking to him. "Jack," he hiccuped. "That's a strong name, Jack. You're being very brave." David reached out and wiped a tear from the boy's cheek with his white glove. "Now, can you tell me what your mummy looks like? We're going to find her together." Jack's voice was small, but he was calming down. She has long brown hair, and she's wearing a red dress with flowers on it." David nodded seriously, as if Jack had just given him crucial military intelligence. "Excellent description, soldier. Now, I need you to do something very important for me. Can you be brave for just a little bit longer?" Jack nodded, his small hand still gripping David's tunic. David stood and, in a move that would later be described as both heartwarming and career-ending by different people, he lifted Jack up and settled the boy on his shoulders. Jack's legs dangled on either side of David's neck, and the boy was now tall enough to see over the heads of the entire crowd. "Now, Jack," David said, his voice carrying authority but also warmth, "you have the high ground. You can see everyone from up there. Look for your mummy's red dress with flowers. Take your time. I've got you." The crowd had formed a circle around them now, but it was different from the usual tourist gawking. People were smiling, some were crying. Mothers held their own children a little tighter. A teenage girl in the crowd started calling out, "Has anyone seen a woman in a red floral dress looking for her son?" The call was picked up by others. "Red floral dress, looking for a little boy in yellow." Jack suddenly shouted, his voice filled with relief and joy. There she is, Mummy." Through the crowd pushed a woman in her early 30s, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wild with panic. When she saw Jack perched on David's shoulders, she let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. "Jack, oh my God, Jack." David carefully lowered the boy to the ground, and Jack ran into his mother's arms. She scooped him up, holding him so tight it looked like she might never let go. She was crying, kissing his head over and over, checking him for injuries even though he was fine. Then she looked up at David, who had retrieved his hat but not yet put it back on, and she broke down completely. "Thank you," she sobbed. "Thank you so much. I only looked away for a second and he was gone. I've been searching for 15 minutes. I was so scared. Thank you, thank you." David smiled, a real, genuine smile that transformed his usually stoic face. He was very brave. You should be proud of him. The woman was shaking. "I don't know how to thank you. You broke protocol for him. You could get in trouble." David looked down at Jack, who was now grinning despite the tear tracks on his face. The boy gave him a small wave. "Some things are more important than protocol," David said quietly. Then he placed his bearskin hat back on his head, brought himself to attention, and saluted the boy. Jack's eyes went wide, and he attempted a salute back, his form terrible but his intent perfect. The crowd erupted in applause. David returned to his post, faced forward, and became still once more. But inside, his heart was racing, and he knew that the moment his shift ended, he would be called into his commander's office. He was right. 2 hours later, still in uniform, he stood at attention in front of Major Williams, who sat behind his desk with an expression that was difficult to read. "Corporal Chen," the major began, his voice neutral, "I've received multiple reports about your conduct this afternoon. I've also seen approximately 47 videos on social media showing you abandoning your post, removing your hat, and hoisting a civilian child onto your shoulders. Would you care to explain yourself?" David kept his eyes forward. "No excuse, sir. I violated protocol. A child was in distress, and I made the decision to assist him. I take full responsibility for my actions and accept whatever consequences you deem appropriate." The silence stretched out. Major Williams tapped a pen against his desk. Then he sighed. "The rule book says you should have remained at your post, that other authorities, security, even other tourists should have handled the situation, that your job is to guard, not to provide social services." He paused. "The rule book is not always right." David's eyes flickered to the major's face in surprise. Major Williams stood and walked around his desk. "I have a 5-year-old nephew, Corporal. If he were lost and terrified in a crowd of strangers, I would hope that someone, anyone, would have the courage and compassion to help him. Protocol be damned." He extended his hand. David, shocked, shook it. "You showed excellent judgment under pressure, Corporal. You assessed the situation, determined that a child's safety was paramount, and you acted with both authority and compassion. Those are the qualities we actually want in our guards, even if the rulebook doesn't always reflect it." David felt his throat tighten. "Thank you, sir." "That said," the major continued, a hint of a smile playing at his lips, "officially, I have to give you a verbal warning about breaking protocol. Unofficially, I've forwarded the video to the recruiting office. They're going to use it in their materials. Turns out, showing that guards are human beings who care about people is excellent for public relations." That night, David called his father and told him what had happened. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then his father, a man who rarely showed emotion, said simply, "I am very proud of you, son. Very proud." The video went viral, as these things do. It was shared millions of times, with captions about faith in humanity and the kindness of strangers. News outlets picked it up. Jack and his mother were interviewed, telling their story of the guard who became a hero. But for David Chen, the moment that mattered most was much simpler. It was the feeling of that small, frightened child calming down in his arms. It was the look of relief on a mother's face. It was the knowledge that, when the choice came between following rules and doing what was right, he had chosen correctly. Some things, he learned that day, are more important than protocol. And sometimes, the most powerful thing a person can do is simply choose to be kind. The autumn leaves were falling around Edinburgh Castle in October 2018, painting the ancient stones in shades of gold and crimson. The tourists were fewer this time of year, mostly serious history enthusiasts and photographers trying to capture the castle's haunting beauty in the soft Scottish light. Among the guards on duty that day was Private Sophie Morrison, one of the first women to serve in the ceremonial guard at the historic fortress. She stood at her post near the main entrance, her rifle held with practiced precision, her expression carefully neutral. Sophie had grown up in a small village outside Glasgow, the daughter of a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat. Joining the military had been Sophie's way out, her path to something bigger than the poverty and limited opportunities of her childhood. She had fought hard to earn her place among the guards, enduring skepticism and occasional hostility from those who believed women didn't belong in such traditional roles. Every day she stood at her post was a statement, a quiet but firm declaration that she had earned her place and would not be moved. The morning had been routine. Tourists took their photographs, children pointed and giggled, and Sophie remained as still as the stone walls behind her. But around 11 o'clock, an elderly man approached. He was well dressed in a tweed jacket and tie, his white hair neatly combed, his posture suggesting military training despite his age. He walked with a cane, each step deliberate and careful. Sophie noticed him immediately, as guards are trained to notice everything. But what caught her attention was not his appearance, but the way he stopped about 10 feet from her position and simply stared. Not in the usual tourist way, taking photos or trying to make her laugh. He just stood there, looking at her with an expression that was impossible to read. Pain, perhaps, or recognition, or both. Minutes passed. The man didn't move. His hands gripped his cane so tightly his knuckles were white. His jaw worked as if he were trying to speak but couldn't find the words. Other tourists began to notice, pointing, whispering. Some took photos of the strange tableau. The old man and the young guard, locked in some silent communication that nobody else could understand. Finally, the man spoke. His voice was rough, Scottish accent thick with emotion. "You remind me of someone." Sophie gave no indication she had heard. Eyes forward, face neutral. The man took a shaky step closer. "My daughter, Sarah, she wanted to be a soldier too, wanted to stand guard at this very castle." His voice broke. "I told her it wasn't for women, told her she was being foolish, told her to find a proper job, get married, stop dreaming about impossible things." The crowd had gone quiet now, sensing this was something more than the usual tourist interaction. The man's eyes were glistening with tears. She stopped talking to me after that. I was so sure I was right, you see. So certain I was protecting her from disappointment and failure. This was 15 years ago, when women in combat roles was still new, still controversial. I thought I was being realistic. I thought I was being a good father. He paused, struggling to maintain his composure. She joined the army anyway. Infantry, deployed to Afghanistan in 2009. She was brilliant, her commanding officers said. Natural leader, brave, skilled. Everything I had told her she couldn't be. Sophie felt something tighten in her chest. She knew where this story was going. Every soldier knows that tone, that particular weight in someone's voice when they talk about the ones who didn't come home. She died in an IED explosion in Helmand Province, April 17, 2010. She was 24 years old. The man's voice was barely audible now. The last time we spoke was the argument. 3 years of silence, and then a knock on my door and 2 soldiers in dress uniform telling me my little girl was gone. A woman in the crowd was crying openly. The man wiped his eyes with a handkerchief, his hands shaking. They gave me her medals, her personal effects, and a letter she had written to be delivered if she died. Do you know what it said? He looked directly at Sophie now as if she might answer. It said, "Dad, I forgive you. I know you were trying to protect me. I hope someday you can be proud of what I chose to become." The man's voice broke completely. He stood there, tears running down his weathered face, his whole body trembling. "I see you standing there, and I see her. I see the daughter I told she wasn't good enough, wasn't strong enough, wasn't meant for this. And I see how wrong I was. How terribly, unforgivably wrong." Sophie's training was screaming at her not to react. Do not move. Do not speak. Do not acknowledge. But there are moments when training becomes irrelevant, when the human heart overrides the soldier's discipline. Slowly, carefully, Sophie did something she had never done on duty before. She turned her head and looked directly at the man. Their eyes met, and in that instant something passed between them. Understanding, forgiveness, shared grief for a girl who had died proving she was more than her father had believed she could be. Then Sophie did something even more unprecedented. She shifted her rifle to her left hand and brought her right hand up in a perfect salute. Not the casual salute of daily military routine, but a slow, deliberate, ceremonial salute. The kind reserved for fallen soldiers in solemn remembrance. The man's knees buckled. He caught himself on his cane, but just barely. His whole body shook with sobs. "Thank you," he whispered, "thank you." Sophie held the salute for 10 full seconds, long enough for the man to understand that it was not just a gesture but a promise, a recognition of his daughter's service, an acknowledgement that she had been right to follow her dreams, right to stand up for what she believed in, right to prove that she belonged. When Sophie finally lowered her hand and returned to her neutral position, the man did something unexpected. He straightened his posture, set his cane aside, and returned the salute with military precision. It was clear he had served once long ago. His form was perfect, his bearing suddenly that of a much younger man. The crowd erupted in applause, but it felt wrong somehow, too celebratory for such a solemn moment. The sound died quickly, replaced by a respectful silence. The man retrieved his cane and took a step forward. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small wooden box. With shaking hands, he opened it to reveal a medal. Sophie recognized it immediately as the Elizabeth Cross, awarded to the next of kin of British Armed Forces personnel killed in action. "I want you to know," the man said, his voice stronger now, "that I keep this with me always, every day. I carry it as a reminder of what I lost and what I failed to understand. My daughter died serving her country with honor. She died doing exactly what she was meant to do, despite what I told her." He closed the box and held it against his chest. "When I saw you standing here, I had to come. I had to tell someone. I had to say out loud that I was wrong and she was right, and I would give anything for one more chance to tell her I was proud. His eyes met Sophie's again. I'm glad women like you are here now. I'm glad the world has changed. I'm glad my daughter's sacrifice wasn't in vain. Sophie wanted to speak, wanted to tell this broken father that his daughter had been a hero, that her choice had been brave, that forgiveness was always possible even across the divide of death. But she couldn't break protocol that far. Instead, she did the only thing she could. She held his gaze for a long moment, allowing him to see the understanding and compassion in her eyes before returning to her forward stance. The man nodded, as if Sophie had spoken volumes. He replaced the box in his jacket, picked up his cane, and turned to leave. But before he took more than a few steps, he paused and spoke one more time, his voice carrying across the quiet courtyard. Her name was Sarah Elizabeth Morrison. I want someone to know her name. I want someone to remember she existed and mattered. Morrison, the same surname as Sophie. It was coincidence, of course. Morrison is a common Scottish name. But somehow in that moment, it felt like more than coincidence. It felt like Sarah had led her father to this spot, to this guard, to this moment of recognition and healing. Sophie remained at her post for another 2 hours. Tourists came and went, taking their photos, making their jokes, trying to get a reaction. But Sophie's mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about a girl named Sarah who had dreamed of standing where Sophie now stood. A girl who had fought for the right to serve and had paid the ultimate price. A girl whose father had finally, after 14 years of grief and regret, found a way to honor her memory. When her shift ended, Sophie returned to the barracks and immediately went to her quarters. She sat on her bunk and pulled out her phone, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then she began to type, searching for information about Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, killed in action in Afghanistan, April 2010. The search results appeared. There she was. Lance Corporal Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, 24, killed by an improvised explosive device while on patrol in Helmand Province. The articles described her as an exemplary soldier, beloved by her unit, recommended for commendation. There was a photo, a young woman with Sophie's same determined expression, wearing her uniform with obvious pride. Sophie read everything she could find. Sarah's story, her service record, the circumstances of her death, the memorial service held in her honor, and Sophie made a decision. She wrote a letter to the commanding officer of Sarah's former unit, explaining what had happened at Edinburgh Castle that day. She asked if there was a memorial, a place where Sarah was remembered. She wanted to visit. She wanted to pay her respects to a sister in arms she had never met but who had paved the way for soldiers like herself. The response came 3 days later. Yes, there was a memorial. Sarah's name was on the wall of the National Memorial Arboretum in Staffordshire, along with all the other British military personnel killed in recent conflicts. Her former unit would be honored to have Sophie visit. 2 weeks later, Sophie stood before that wall, her hand resting on Sarah's name carved into the stone. She wore her dress uniform, medals polished, posture perfect, and she gave Sarah the salute she deserved, the recognition her father had finally learned to offer. But Sophie did something more. She started a tradition among the women serving in the ceremonial guards. Once a year, on April 17th, they would gather and remember Sarah Elizabeth Morrison and all the women who had fought for the right to serve. They would tell their stories, honor their sacrifices, and remind themselves that their presence in these historic roles had been earned with blood and determination. The old man, whose name Sophie later learned was Malcolm Morrison, never returned to Edinburgh Castle. He passed away quietly in his sleep 18 months after their encounter, the Elizabeth Cross still in his pocket. But in his will, he left a donation to a charity supporting female veterans, with a note that simply read, "In memory of my daughter Sarah, who was braver than I ever gave her credit for." And Sophie Morrison, no relation but forever connected, continued to stand her post at Edinburgh Castle. She stood for herself, for Sarah, for all the women who had been told they didn't belong and proved otherwise. She stood with pride, with purpose, and with the understanding that sometimes breaking protocol is not a violation of duty, but the truest expression of it. Christmas Eve 2021 arrived cold and clear in London, the kind of crisp winter day that made the city sparkle under strings of holiday lights. Buckingham Palace was decorated for the season, wreaths hanging on gates, garlands wrapped around lampposts, the whole scene looking like something from a Victorian Christmas card. The tourists were sparse, most people home with their families, preparing for the next day's celebrations. But a few hardy souls still came to see the guards, to take their holiday photos, to witness the unchanging traditions that made Britain feel eternal. Lance Corporal Michael Okonkwo stood at his post, grateful for the relative quiet. This was his first Christmas on duty, his first holiday season away from his family in Birmingham. His mother had cried when he told her he wouldn't be home, even though she was proud of his service. His younger siblings had begged him to ask for leave, but someone had to work on Christmas Eve, and Michael had volunteered, knowing that some of the other guards had young children waiting at home. The afternoon was uneventful until about 3 o'clock, when Michael noticed a small commotion near the palace gates. A group of people were gathered around something, their voices carrying concern and urgency. Security was already moving that direction, but Michael's attention was caught by a sound that cut through the holiday murmur. A child was crying, not the normal fussy crying of a tired toddler, but the kind of desperate, gasping sobs that signal real distress. Through his peripheral vision, Michael tracked the situation. A woman was on her knees on the pavement. A little girl of maybe 7 or 8 collapsed in her arms. The child was convulsing, her small body jerking in frightening spasms. The woman was screaming now, words tumbling over each other in panic. "She's having a seizure. Someone help, please. She has epilepsy. I don't have her medicine. I forgot her medicine." Security was there, radios out, calling for medical assistance. But the nearest ambulance would take time, and the woman was hysterical, her panic feeding the child's distress. The little girl's eyes had rolled back, foam appearing at the corners of her mouth. Michael's mind raced. He had training for this. Basic first aid was part of his military education. He knew what to do for someone having a seizure, but he was on duty, at his post. Guards did not leave their positions. Guards did not interfere. Guards maintained their discipline no matter what. The woman was begging now, her voice raw with terror. "Please, somebody help my baby, please." Other tourists were trying to help, but they clearly didn't know what to do. Someone was filming on their phone. Someone else was suggesting they hold the child down. Wrong, dangerously wrong. They could hurt her, make things worse. Michael made his decision in less than a second. He secured his rifle and moved. Not the stiff, ceremonial movements of the changing of the guard, but the quick, purposeful stride of a soldier responding to an emergency. The crowd parted as he approached, this red-coated guard breaking every rule of protocol to intervene in a medical crisis. He knelt beside the woman and the seizing child. His voice was calm, authoritative, cutting through the panic. "Ma'am, I'm trained in first aid. I'm going to help your daughter. What's her name?" The woman looked at him with wild eyes, not quite processing that the guard, the living statue, was speaking to her. "Lily. Her name is Lily." "Okay, how long has she been seizing?" 2 minutes, maybe 3. I don't know, I lost track. Oh God, is she going to be okay?" Michael was already moving, gently positioning the child on her side, clearing the area around her, checking her airway. The seizure was violent, but he had seen this before during his medical training. The key was to keep her safe until it passed. "She's going to be okay," Michael said with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. "Ma'am, I need you to stay calm for Lily. Can you do that?" The woman nodded, tears streaming down her face. She was clutching Lily's coat, her knuckles white. Michael removed his thick red tunic and folded it, placing it carefully under Lily's head to protect her from the hard pavement. Now in just his white shirt, he looked less like a ceremonial guard and more like what he truly was, a soldier trained to help in crisis situations. "Someone time this," he called out to the crowd. "How long since the seizure started?" A man checked his phone. 4 minutes now. That was too long. Most seizures lasted only a minute or two. Michael's concern deepened, but he kept his face calm for the mother's sake. "The ambulance is coming," security informed him. "ETA 6 minutes." Michael nodded. He bent low, speaking softly near Lily's ear. "Lily, if you can hear me, you're safe. I've got you. Your mum is right here. You're going to be okay." The seizure was beginning to ease, the violent jerking subsiding into smaller tremors. Michael kept his hand on her shoulder, steady and reassuring. The crowd had gone completely silent, everyone holding their breath. "Come on, sweetheart," Michael murmured. "Come back to us." And then, like a switch being flipped, the seizure stopped. Lily went limp, her breathing ragged but steady. Her eyes fluttered open, confused and unfocused. "Mummy," she whispered. The mother sobbed, reaching for her daughter, but Michael gently stopped her. "Give her a moment. She's going to be confused and tired. Let her orient herself before we move her." He looked at Lily, his voice soft. "Hey there, Lily, you're okay. You had a seizure, but it's over now. You're safe." Lily blinked at him, trying to focus. "Who are you?" Michael smiled. "My name is Michael. I'm a soldier. I'm here to help you." "Are you a Christmas soldier?" Lily asked, her voice small and wondering, like the one in the story. Michael felt his throat tighten. "Yeah, sweetheart, I'm a Christmas soldier, and I'm going to make sure you're okay." The ambulance arrived moments later, sirens wailing, paramedics moving with practiced efficiency. They took over from Michael, checking Lily's vitals, asking questions, preparing to transport her to the hospital. The mother was answering their questions through tears, explaining about the epilepsy, the forgotten medication, the stress of traveling for the holidays. As the paramedics worked, the mother suddenly looked around for Michael. He was standing a few feet back, his red tunic still on the ground where he'd used it as a pillow for Lily. The mother grabbed his hand. "You saved her, you left your post. You could get in trouble. Why did you do that?" Michael looked at her, at this terrified mother who had almost lost her daughter on Christmas Eve, and he answered with complete honesty. "Because she needed help, and I could help her. That's all the reason I needed." The mother hugged him, not caring about protocol or propriety, just a grateful parent embracing the stranger who had helped her child. Michael hugged her back, his training forgotten, just being human in a moment that demanded humanity. As the paramedics loaded Lily into the ambulance, she called out, "Michael, the Christmas soldier." He moved to the ambulance door. Lily was pale, exhausted, but smiling. "Will you come visit me?" she asked. "After Christmas." Michael felt his eyes sting. "If your mum says it's okay, I'd be honored." The mother, climbing into the ambulance beside her daughter, nodded through her tears. "Please, please come. I want to thank you properly. I want Lily to remember the man who helped her." The ambulance pulled away, lights flashing but sirens silent now that the immediate emergency had passed. Michael stood in the street, still in just his white shirt despite the cold, his red tunic crumpled on the ground, and realized that about 200 people were staring at him. And then they started clapping, not the polite applause of an audience, but the thunderous, emotional appreciation of witnesses to an act of genuine heroism. Phones were out. The entire incident had been recorded from multiple angles, but nobody seemed to care about making the guard break character anymore. They had witnessed something far more important. Michael retrieved his tunic, shook it out, and put it back on. He returned to his post, came to attention, and stared straight ahead once more. But his commanding officer was already there, having been radioed about the incident. "Lance Corporal Okonkwo," the officer said, his voice stern. "A word, please." Michael followed him to a private area, standing at attention, prepared for the reprimand he knew was coming. The officer looked at him for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. "That was well done, soldier, very well done." Michael blinked in surprise. "Sir." "You assessed the situation, recognized that a child's life was more important than protocol, and you acted decisively and competently. You probably saved that little girl's life, or at the very least prevented serious injury." The officer paused. "You're going to be all over social media by tonight. The tabloids will probably run it tomorrow. Guard breaks protocol to save seizing child on Christmas Eve. It's going to be a PR nightmare for the traditionalists." "I'm sorry, sir." "Don't be. I've already spoken to the higher-ups. We're not disciplining you. In fact, we're commending you. What you did exemplifies the true spirit of service. You put the welfare of a citizen above adherence to ceremony. That's what being a soldier is actually about." Michael felt relief wash over him. "Thank you, sir." "That said," the officer continued, "you're done for the day. Go get warm, call your family. It's Christmas Eve. You should be with people who love you." Michael nodded but hesitated. "Sir, if it's all right, I'd like to finish my shift. Someone would have to cover for me, and they should be with their families too." The officer studied him, then nodded with obvious respect. "You're a good man, Okonkwo, carry on." Michael returned to his post for the final 2 hours of his shift. Tourists approached him differently now. No more trying to make him laugh or testing his discipline. Instead, they quietly thanked him. Parents with children told him he was a hero. An elderly veteran saluted him with tears in his eyes. When his shift finally ended and he returned to the barracks, he found his phone flooded with messages. The video had indeed gone viral. News outlets were requesting interviews, but among all the messages was one that mattered most. It was from his mother. "I saw what you did. I am so proud of you, my son. You are the best of us. Merry Christmas." Michael visited Lily in the hospital 2 days after Christmas, bringing a small stuffed bear in a guard's uniform. She was recovering well, the doctors having adjusted her medication. She lit up when she saw him, even in civilian clothes. "You came," the Christmas soldier came. They talked for an hour, Michael telling her stories about being a guard, Lily telling him about school and her friends and her epilepsy. The mother, whose name was Caroline, cried again when she thanked him, explaining that Lily had been talking about her Christmas miracle non-stop. As Michael left the hospital that day, walking out into the cold London afternoon, he thought about what it meant to be a guard. Not the ceremony, not the tradition, not the protocol, but the deeper meaning, to protect, to serve, to help those who need it. He had broken protocol on Christmas Eve. He had abandoned his post, removed his uniform tunic, knelt on the cold pavement and helped a seizing child. And in doing so, he had been more of a guard, more of a soldier, more of a servant of the people than he ever had been standing motionless at his post. Some rules, he understood now, existed to maintain order and tradition. But some moments transcended rules. Some moments demanded that we remember we are human beings first, with human compassion and human responsibility to help one another. And on that Christmas Eve, in front of Buckingham Palace, decorated for the holidays and witnessed by hundreds of strangers, Lance Corporal Michael Okonkwo had chosen humanity over protocol. It was, everyone agreed, the most Christmas thing anyone could have done. The spring morning was absolutely perfect in May 2023, the kind of day that made London feel like the most beautiful city in the world. Flowers bloomed in the palace gardens, the sun painted everything in warm golden light, and tourists filled the streets in cheerful crowds. At the Tower of London, the yeoman warders were conducting their daily routines, and among the ceremonial guards stood Sergeant Emma Fitzgerald, a 10-year veteran whose discipline was legendary even among her peers. Emma had never broken protocol, not once in 10 years of service. She had stood through rainstorms and heat waves, through protests and celebrations, through moments that tested every ounce of her self-control. She prided herself on being unshakable, the perfect example of what a guard should be. Her fellow soldiers sometimes joked that she was more statue than human, and Emma took it as the compliment it was meant to be. The morning tour were running smoothly until approximately 10:30, when Emma noticed an unusual group approaching. An elderly man in a wheelchair, pushed by a younger woman who was clearly his daughter, and flanked by what appeared to be several grandchildren ranging in age from teenagers down to a little girl of about 6. But what caught Emma's attention was not the family itself, but the decorations on the wheelchair. It was covered in military medals, dozens of them pinned to a blanket draped over the man's lap. Campaign medals, service medals, medals Emma recognized from World War II and conflicts she only knew from history books. The man himself was ancient, likely in his late 90s, his hands gnarled with arthritis, his face mapped with wrinkles that told stories of a long and difficult life. The family stopped about 15 feet from Emma's post. The daughter leaned down to speak to the old man, but he shook his head. He was staring at Emma with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. His eyes, though clouded with age, held a sharpness that suggested his mind was still very much present. Then the little girl, the youngest of the grandchildren, broke away from the group and approached Emma directly. She was carrying something, holding it carefully with both hands as if it were the most precious thing in the world. As she got closer, Emma could see it was a photograph in a silver frame, old and faded. The girl stopped right in front of Emma and held up the photograph so the guard could see it. It showed a young woman in a World War II-era military uniform, standing at attention, her expression serious and proud. She looked remarkably like Emma. Same strong jawline, same determined eyes, same posture of absolute discipline. "This is my great-great-grandmother," the little girl said, her voice clear and confident. "Her name was Elizabeth Fitzgerald. She was a servicewoman during the war. My great-great-grandfather says you look just like her." Emma's training held her still, but inside she felt a jolt of recognition. Fitzgerald was her surname too, though it was common enough that it didn't necessarily mean anything. Still, the resemblance was uncanny. The girl continued, clearly reciting something she had been told to say. "Great-great-grandpa wanted to come here today because this is where he proposed to her. Right here, at the Tower of London in 1945 when she was on duty. She wasn't supposed to talk to him, but he kept coming back every day until she finally smiled at him. He says it took 3 weeks." The old man had been wheeled closer now. His voice, when he spoke, was thin and wavering but determined. 78 years ago today, I asked Elizabeth to marry me. She was standing exactly where you are standing now. She was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and the strongest woman I had ever known." His eyes were wet with tears. "We had 63 years together before cancer took her, and not a day goes by that I don't miss her." The daughter spoke now, her voice gentle. "Dad was diagnosed with terminal cancer 3 months ago. The doctors say he has weeks, maybe a month. His dying wish was to come back here one more time, to the place where his life truly began." Emma felt something crack inside her chest. This was not a tourist trying to make her laugh. This was not someone testing her discipline. This was a dying man making a pilgrimage to honor the love of his life, a woman who had served just as Emma served now. The old man reached into his jacket with shaking hands and pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it to reveal a ring, simple and elegant, the gold worn thin from decades of wear. This was Elizabeth's wedding ring. She wore it for 63 years. When she died, I had it cleaned and kept it safe, waiting for the right person to have it. He looked at Emma with an intensity that seemed to see through her uniform, through her training, through everything to the person beneath. "Are you family? A Fitzgerald?" Emma couldn't answer, shouldn't answer, but the old man seemed to understand. "Elizabeth's brother had children, grandchildren. I lost touch with most of the family after she died, retreated into my grief. But if you're one of hers, one of her bloodline, then you carry her strength, her courage, her discipline." His voice broke. "And I would be honored if you would have this ring. Not to wear, perhaps, but to keep. To remember that a woman named Elizabeth Fitzgerald stood where you stand now, served with honor, and was loved beyond measure." This was impossible. Guards did not accept gifts. Guards did not interact beyond the bare minimum required for safety. Guards did not break character for sentimental reasons, no matter how touching the story. But Emma was thinking about her own grandmother, who had told her stories about a great aunt Elizabeth who served in the war, who had been stationed at the Tower of London, who had married a soldier and lived a long, happy life. Family stories that Emma had always assumed were embellished, made more dramatic in the retelling. Could this be the same Elizabeth? Could this dying man be telling her about her own family history, a story she had heard fragments of but never fully known? The old man was holding out the ring box, his hand trembling with the effort. "Please, it would mean everything to me. To know that a piece of Elizabeth continues on, protecting this place she loved, carrying on the tradition of service she held so dear." Emma made a decision that went against every rule in the book, every principle of protocol she had upheld for 10 years. She moved, just slightly, just enough to lower her gaze from the middle distance to look directly at the old man. Their eyes met, and in that instant Emma saw everything. The young soldier who had fallen in love with a woman in uniform, the decades of marriage, the challenges and joys, the grief of loss, the final pilgrimage of a dying man who wanted to honor his wife's memory one last time. Emma couldn't take the ring. She couldn't move her hands from her rifle, but she could give this man something else. She could give him acknowledgement, recognition, the knowledge that his Elizabeth was remembered, honored, celebrated in the woman who now stood at the same post. Slowly, deliberately, Emma's lips curved into a smile. Not a laugh, not a smirk, but a genuine, warm smile of understanding and connection. The first smile she had ever given while on duty in 10 years of service. The old man's face transformed. He started laughing and crying at the same time, a sound of pure joy and relief. "She smiled," he gasped. "Just like Elizabeth, just like the day she finally smiled at me after 3 weeks of me making a fool of myself trying to get her attention." The daughter was crying. The grandchildren were crying. The little girl was grinning up at Emma like she had just witnessed magic. The old man closed the ring box and held it against his heart. Thank you for that smile. I can die happy now, knowing that Elizabeth's legacy continues, that women like you still stand guard, still serve with honor, still carry her strength forward." He gestured to his daughter, who wheeled him closer. With enormous effort, the old man straightened his bent spine, brought his gnarled hand up to his forehead, and gave Emma the most perfect military salute his aged body could manage. Emma felt tears prick her eyes. Every instinct screamed at her to remain neutral, to return to protocol. But this moment was bigger than protocol. This moment was about honoring service, honoring love, honoring a connection that spanned generations and decades. Emma brought her rifle to present arms and held the position, a ceremonial salute typically reserved for royalty and high-ranking officers. But this old soldier, this man who had loved a servicewoman with such devotion that he spent his final days making a pilgrimage to honor her memory, deserved nothing less. She held the position for 10 full seconds. The old man held his salute despite the obvious pain it caused him, and in that moment, time seemed to stop. The tourists, the tower, the modern world all faded away, leaving just two soldiers honoring each other across the divide of age and time. When they finally lowered their salutes, the old man was smiling through his tears. "Elizabeth would have liked you," he said simply. The family began to leave, the daughter carefully wheeling her father away, the grandchildren walking quietly beside them, all of them wiping their eyes. But the little girl ran back one more time. "My name is Elizabeth too," she said to Emma. "Named after my great-great-grandmother. When I grow up, I want to be a guard like both of you." Emma couldn't speak, but she gave the little girl a small nod. The child beamed, then ran back to her family. Emma returned to her neutral position, eyes forward, expression composed. But she was shaking slightly, the emotion of the moment threatening to overwhelm her legendary discipline. The tourists who had witnessed the exchange were crying, hugging each other, taking photos not in mockery but in reverence. That afternoon, Emma's commanding officer called her in. She stood at attention, prepared for consequences. "Sergeant Fitzgerald," he began, "I've received a rather extraordinary message. From a Mr. Robert Mac Lesh, aged 96, currently in hospice care. He wanted us to know that you made his final wish come true, that you honored the memory of his late wife with grace and compassion, and that he is grateful beyond words." The officer paused. "He also wanted us to know that he's leaving a donation to the Military Benevolent Fund in the name of Elizabeth Fitzgerald, his wife, and Emma Fitzgerald, the guard who reminded him why he fell in love with a soldier all those years ago." Emma felt her throat constrict. "Sir, I broke protocol. I smiled while on duty. I acknowledged a civilian. I gave a ceremonial salute to a non-ranking individual." The officer looked at her steadily. "You did, and you also reminded everyone who saw it that we don't serve protocols. We serve people. We serve history. We serve the ideals of honor and duty and compassion that make this service meaningful." He pulled out a file. "I did some research after receiving Mr. Mac Lesh's message. Elizabeth Fitzgerald, served 1942-1947, stationed at the Tower of London 1944-1945. Married to Robert Mac Lesh, June 1945. Brother James Fitzgerald had 2 children, one of whom had a daughter named Catherine, who had a daughter named Emma." He looked up. "That's you, Sergeant. You're her great-great-niece. That man who came to see you today married into your family 78 years ago, and you never knew." Emma felt the world tilt. "I had no idea, sir." "Family histories get lost sometimes, but you found a piece of yours today, and you honored it the only way you could within the constraints of your duty," he smiled. "There will be no reprimand. What you did was exactly right." Robert Mac Lesh passed away 6 days later, peacefully, surrounded by his family. His daughter sent Emma a letter describing his final days, how he talked constantly about the guard who smiled at him, who reminded him of his Elizabeth, who made him feel like his pilgrimage had been worthwhile. In his final hours, he clutched Elizabeth's ring and smiled, saying he could see her waiting for him. The ring, according to the will, was left to Emma with a note. "For the guard who carries Elizabeth's strength, may you know you are part of a legacy of service and honor. May you understand that breaking protocol for the right reasons is sometimes the truest form of duty. And may you, like my Elizabeth, find someone who loves you for exactly who you are." Emma kept the ring in a small box in her quarters. She never wore it, but she looked at it often, a reminder that she was part of something larger than herself. A legacy of strong women who served, who stood their posts, who protected and honored and gave their all. But she also kept it as a reminder that sometimes the rules exist to guide us, not to bind us. That sometimes humanity and compassion are more important than rigid adherence to protocol. That the best service comes from the heart, not just from training. Emma Fitzgerald served 8 more years in the ceremonial guard before retiring. She never broke protocol again, never needed to. But she was different after that day in May when she smiled at a dying man and honored a connection that spanned generations. She was still disciplined, still professional, still the epitome of what a guard should be. But she was also more human, more connected, more aware that beneath the uniform and the ceremony and the tradition, service is ultimately about people. Protecting them, honoring them, remembering them, and sometimes in the most sacred moments, simply acknowledging their humanity with your own. And that, Emma understood, was the most important duty of all.